Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Isn't it wonderful to see people in these seats again? Thank you for being here. It's been a very long couple of years, just me coming in performing for empty houses in here to make myself busy. My name is Katie Collins. I work here at the Capitol Center for the Arts and the Bank of New Hampshire stage. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce this forum this evening because even though I have been at the Capitol Center for almost 17 years, prior to that, I was the executive director of the New Hampshire Writers Project for 5 years. So anything to do with New Hampshire's literary landscape is very near and dear to my heart. So I was thrilled that Paul asked me to come and introduce this program. I hope that if this is your first visit to the Bank of New Hampshire stage, that it won't be your last. Please check out our roster of upcoming events on ccanh.com. Next week, we have another wonderful author event with Howard Mansfield featuring some beautiful music. So come back and see us next week as well. I'm going to introduce our moderator tonight, Laura Knoy, and then she's going to take it from there in her capable hands. Anyone who's been a listener of NHPR knows Laura well from her 25 years hosting The Exchange, New Hampshire's only radio call-in talk show. She stepped away from that in June of 2021 to pursue other interests, including finishing her novel. How appropriate. Laura's interviewed everybody from your local selectmen to presidential hopefuls. She's held discussions with local officials in small towns, conversations with our congressional delegates and our governor, and interacted with hundreds of state lawmakers, hosted congressional debates, candidates forums, and tonight, authors forums. Along with her production team on The Exchange, Laura also steered multi-day, in-depth coverage on topics ranging from mental health and the opioid crisis to enjoying New Hampshire's beautiful natural environment. In her free time, Laura is likely to be in the woods, by a lake, or reading a good book. How appropriate. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Laura Knoy. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Katie, for that lovely introduction. And I second your emotion. It is wonderful to see faces not surrounded by little screens. So it's great to see you all. Thank you all for being here. Before we begin the official program that we're all here for tonight, I do want to give a huge, huge thank you to our sponsors, the Dupree Companies, Gibson's Bookstore, Concord TV, and the Concord Public Library. Thank you very, very much to them for making this evening possible. Great. And now, welcome everyone to a conversation with Concord-Area Authors. Our discussion fits perfectly with the ever-growing interest here in the Granite State to eat local, shop local, and now I say let's add read local to that list. Toward that end, I am thrilled to be here at the Bank of New Hampshire stage with 4 Concord area authors. We're going to talk about their books, their writing process, and what it is about our fair capital city that inspires them. We're also going to take your questions too, of course, about 20 minutes in, so don't be shy. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Around that time, just raise your hand. We have 2 volunteers, and they'll come around with the microphone and take your question. Now, let me introduce our 4 authors. Please hold your applause to the end. We are starting with Margaret Porter. She's an award-winning and best-selling author of more than 24 works of historical fiction. Margaret is also a former stage actress who worked in film, TV, and radio. Her latest book is The Limits of Limelight, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. Margaret, it's great to be here with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura.
Also with us, next to Margaret, is Mark Okrant. He's the author of more than 12 books, including his acclaimed Carrie Turnell mystery series, set in famous places around New Hampshire. That's a niche that Mark created based on his longtime work as a professor in tourism management and policy at Plymouth State University. And Mark, it's really nice to meet you. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. Thank you, Laura.
Also with us, we have Virginia Mcgregor, who sometimes writes under the pen name Nina Monroe. Virginia writes novels about family, friendship, motherhood, and community. Her latest is called The Children's Secret. You probably have seen it featured just recently at Gibson's. Virginia began her career as a boarding school English teacher in Britain, but her first languages were German and French. Welcome, Virginia. It's good to have you. Thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least is Paul Brogan. He's the author of several successful books and the recipient of numerous writing awards, including from the New Hampshire Press Association. Paul hosts the Capital Area Chat Show on Concord TV. His latest book is about the very place where we sit tonight. It's called The Concord Theater. Paul, thank you for helping us pull this event together, and it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now let's give our authors a huge round of applause. So, all of you, you don't need me to tell you this. Writing is not an always easy path. What draws you to do this? And Virginia, I'm going to turn to you first. What pulls you to this field?
I feel that we are intrinsically storytelling creatures, that we weave stories orally and in written form as a way to understand ourselves, our place in the world, our past, our present, our future. And so being part of that endeavor as a writer feels like a tremendous privilege. It feels like a wonderful thing to do as an individual as I try to work out what it means to be human and to live in this complicated and messy world. And it also feels like a wonderful sort of joint endeavor as I think of being part of a whole history of authors who have tried to question, what it means to live in the world, what it means to relate to each other, what it means to face, adversity, to fall in love, to face all these wonderful human situations. And so I just feel like it's an essential part of being alive in the world. And I have small children now, and I see how instinctively they respond to story, how much they love stories, to read them, but also how they tell stories, how it's their way of understanding their little lives too. So to me, it feels like one of the most essential things to do in the world, to be a storyteller, and it feels like a tremendous privilege. So part of it is hard, it can feel lonely at times. I think the business side of it can be tricky, but I think the process of writing a story and telling a story is a wonderful privilege.
And maybe a little later I can ask some of you about the business side of it, because that can be hard.
Yeah.
How about you, Margaret? What keeps you coming to that keyboard day after day?
Oh, so many things. First of all, I think the main thing is curiosity. It's partly curiosity about my characters, how they will surprise me in a given writing session, and how I will surprise them with what I come up with, or how I try to manipulate them into the plot and make sure that they're doing what they need to do. Another one is just habit. I've been a published author since I was in my 20s, and so I've been a writer since I was a child, and it's just part of my entire being, and has been for so much of my life. And then the other thing, and this touches on the business side, is the deadline. You make a commitment, and you have to deliver the finished book at certain times, whether it's the finished manuscript and then the copy edits go through, and if you have a contract, then you have a legal deadline by which you have to deliver the book. And the publisher's schedules are set in stone so early in the process that you know the publication date sometimes before you've finished writing the book. So it's really up to you to maintain that consistency of writing and maintaining the schedule and living up to the expectations, because there's so many people that you would be letting down if you don't. Not just the editors, but also the marketing department and the copy editors and everything like that. So you're really part of a team, and you have to pull your own weight.
Yeah,
it's really important.
I'm hearing what people often say about writing. It's a discipline, and I'm hearing that. And as most people in this audience can guess, I love deadlines. I think they're great. That's great. I'm really interested in, Margaret, I might ask you later what she said about what my characters will do. That's really very interesting, but I want to pull our other guests in first. How about you, Mark? What compels you to write? You've written a bunch of novels.
I came at this process a much different way from my colleagues on the panel. I went to graduate school, became a professor, started writing a lot of technical papers, had to write lectures that would make sense to students. When I moved to the state, I was hired to develop the state's first academic tourism program. And I was received by the tourism industry so well that I was determined that I would spend the rest of my career giving something back to them. So I did that in 3 ways. I did develop the academic program. I've done research and written technical papers for the State Division of Travel and Tourism Development. But then I felt I wanted to do something else. And about this time, and I was in my 40s, I'd never read a murder mystery before in my life. I picked one up and I was sold, and I thought, I think I could do this. I think I could write a murder mystery that my students would find compelling. And I'll tell you the rest of that story in a while.
Well, I don't want to forget you, Paul. What brings you to the keyboard, to the discipline of writing, as Margaret described? What inspires you?
Well, I grew up in Concord, and one of my favorite places to spend Saturday was the Concord Public Library. I probably read thousands of books through the years from there. And I was just mesmerized by the variety of titles and the books that were there. And I remember when I was about 9 saying to Lois Markey, who was our librarian, gee, someday I want to have a book on the shelf of this library. And she didn't say, well, that's nice, dear, you know, dream on. She said, if you really want it, it'll happen. And so that was always in the back of my mind to do, but I got sidetracked by so many other things. So it was after 50 that I finally sat down and said, I want to write a book because I think I have something I want to say and something I want to tell. And what had always fascinated me about the books I'd read were that they were a record of something, someone's heart and soul, their ideas, or a time. And so that was sort of a drive when I finally did that. And I, very much like some of the other authors here, I love the deadline. There was an adrenaline that was formed. When I wrote the second book, the Concord Theater book, I actually kept track of the time I spent working on it, and it was 1,875 hours I found by the time I finished. But I loved doing that because it had to be like a job. I had to say every day from 9 to 12, and then from 1 to 4, I need to be there typing. Even if it's something I end up throwing away the next day, you need to have a discipline, and that discipline is so important in when you actually follow through and make what you're thinking a reality.
Wow, it's interesting. So up here on stage, we have 2 of you that have been writing for a long time and kind of always wanted to be writers, and then 2 of you who kind of came at it later in life after a career and so forth. Although, Margaret, you did have a career, as I said, in film and stage. So how did that sort of shape the writing that you do?
Well, I started out in theater as a child actress at age 10, and I think that's about the time I started writing novels. So it was kind of a balanced thing, the writing and daydreaming, whatever it might be, making up stories with paper dolls. That was a daytime thing, and the theater was a nighttime thing. And for years, all the way through high school, college, up to graduate school, I was performing, and I was also writing novels, none of which will ever see the light of day. But it was kind of the strange thing about the trajectory of career, getting into radio, TV, film, and then moving away from all those contacts, getting married, getting a personal computer for a wedding present, and having the time to sit down and really focus on it. And that's when it happened for me professionally. I've done various kinds of writing, nonfiction and scripting and different kinds of things, but the fiction writing and historical fiction was always what I read as a child. It was what I always wanted to do, and that's what my first novels were, and that's what my latest novels are. But it's strange to think that after working with casts of dozens and groups of dozens and dozens of people, and now my career is mostly sitting alone in a room with a dog and sometimes with a husband in the room, like I don't even know he's there most of the time. I'm so into it. But it's funny to think, I wanted to be on stage and be the performer with all the people and everything, and now it's events like this where I get to be with all the people and my
different.
peers. It's completely different, but people change over time,
Right.
and it's what suits me.
Well, and rest assured, we definitely will go to your questions in about 10 minutes. So start thinking about what you might want to ask these Concord area authors about. And at that time, I'll remind you, and you can just hold your hand up and we'll bring the microphone around. We really have plenty of time to take your questions. But we shouldn't go too much further with asking you about your latest books, some of which are displayed up here. So I think I'm going to start with you first, Paul, asking about your latest book, because your book, The Concord Theater, is relevant to just why we're here tonight. It's just a beautiful story.
Well, I knew when I started working here when I was a teenager that it was something remarkable and special. It had already been here at that time for about 34 years, and Teresa, who ran it, had been there from the beginning. And I just love the fact that she treated me as though I were an adult and asked my opinion. And I saw how hard she worked. And I said to her at one time, probably in the early 70s, you really should write a book. You should tell the story of this theater. And she said, oh no, I don't have time. I'm here all the time. And so I really kept it in the back of my mind as something that needed to be told. And I would take notes and write down, different experiences that occurred during those years.
When you were, pardon me for interrupting, even when you were young, you were taking notes.
Oh yes.
And let me just, and pardon the interruption again, there may be people in this audience who are newer to Concord who may not know, Paul, that where we are now used to be the Concord Theater. It was this old theater that...
For 61 years.
For 61 years. So go ahead, I just want to put that context in for people who might not realize.
And it is the only theater in history, according to the Guinness people who are verifying it, to be a first-run movie theater run by a woman. And if they can verify and confirm that, there are second-run theaters and things like that were run by a woman. This was a first-run movie theater for 61 years. So if they confirm that, the Bank of New Hampshire stage will get a plaque that will indicate that in this location. But it was just, you met everyone in the city here, and it was just a great, wonderful place to be around creativity, to watch the movies and understand that people wrote the screenplays and the work that they put into creating what you were then sitting in the audience watching. And so it was a very stimulating, creative experience for the 27 years that I was associated with it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. In the book, too, you learn about not just the theater and Teresa who ran it, but also just it's kind of a little mini history of film and a little mini history of Concord. For example, I won't give too much away, but there were certain movies that Teresa wanted to play that Paul said, yes, we should play, and there was public outcry. People said no, including, some of the priests at Teresa's church said, you should not play that movie.
Yes.
So it's very interesting.
They told her she was going to hell if she played Valley of the Dolls because it was condemned by the Legion of Decency.
Which you told her to play.
Yes, I did tell her to play that. And I was called into the administrator's office at Bishop Brady. Father Limoges told me I was going to be committing a mortal sin at every showing of the film, and I needed to go to confession, which I did every Saturday to confess I had been in the presence of the film.
Anyway, there's lots of fascinating stories like that in the book. But Mark, I want to turn to you. Again, you've written a bunch of mysteries about these different locations around New Hampshire, a Seacoast one, a State House one. I think there's one at the Balsams, if I have that right, and all sorts of places where people are going to go, oh, I've been there. What's your latest New Hampshire mystery about? Just give us a little taste there.
Well, I've actually put together 5 novellas. It's not a case of talking about one, but They take you from the Cog Railway and the Mount Washington Auto Road down to here in Concord. My book, which is the cover of which is right behind me, is set at the State House and at the Science Discovery Center, and at Beaver Meadow, the state's oldest golf course. And from there I went to the Mount Washington cruise ship. We've gone to Manchester and Dover and Portsmouth.
Wow.
When the series started, my character, Kerry Turnell, was basically a professor about to retire, professor of criminology, thought he could help solve crimes. By the time we get into this last grouping, he is a commissioner charged with protecting the state's image against people who commit harsh crimes against visitors. And so I think you'll find that in my books, we spend quite a bit of time. My background is academic background is in geography, so I'm really concerned with settings and the role that settings play in the entire murder process. So who knows? This could be next. But I have to tell you, just as a quick aside, that I probably, if you went back 50 or so years, I'd be the last person you'd suspect would be sitting up here.
Really? Why is that?
Well, when I was an undergraduate student, I was required to take a test in order to move on to the second year of college English. And I had to write an essay. I thought I was pretty clever, and so I sat down and for a half an hour I wrote an essay about why John F. Kennedy was good or bad. I don't even remember. And I failed the test. Best thing that ever happened to me, because they put me in an advanced English composition class, and wow, did I learn from that.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Had that not happened, I wouldn't be here.
Right. So I just finished your latest book, Virginia, The Children's Secret, but give us just the best short description.
So it's set in a fictional town in northern New Hampshire, but next to Colebrook, which is a real place, as you know. It's a contemporary novel, and it tackles one of the sort of thorniest issues in American society, which is gun control, but in a very domestic way. So the inspiration behind it was that I came to a mother's book group, and I'd freshly arrived from England. I was pregnant with my second daughter, and the mothers started debating whether they would allow their children to play in a house with firearms. And I remember feeling just like the world froze around me, and I suddenly felt very much like a foreigner, because that's not a question we would ever have to ask ourselves in the UK, where even the Metropolitan Police aren't armed. And I know when I have a good story idea when I get a very vivid sense of what the opening might look like. And so to me, I immediately felt it was the end of a summer, there was a heat wave, a group of children come together at a children's party, it's a farmhouse, there's a barn, it's just before school's going to start again, and a child gets shot at that party. And then the whole community fractures around it. So I love to write from multiple points of view. And although the gun issue is sort of the catalyst for the novel, really what it's about is what all my novels really are about, which is community, friendship, family, parenthood. And in this case, what it means to live with people who hold very different views from you, and also to live with people when a tragedy has taken place that creates lots of divisions within that community. And having come from England to America at a time where everything seems increasingly polarized politically, it was really interesting for me to have a sort of insight into American life and into something that might create these divisions within a small community. That said, it's also a love letter to New Hampshire and to the seasons and to the beauty of New Hampshire, and the setting was really important to me to sort of create this place that I'd come to love. So that's sort of a bit of the background to the book.
Yeah, so the community sort of fractures, marriages fracture too.
Yep.
You know, husbands and wives have real debates about
Yep.
how they're responding to this and so forth. We won't give too much away,
Yes.
but yes, and I agree, it is a love letter to northern New
Yeah.
England, the descriptions
Yeah.
of the seasons and the snow and the fall. So late last year, Margaret, I finished The Limits of Limelight and really enjoyed it. So just give us a short little teaser for that one, for your latest.
Well, everyone knows about Ginger Rogers, and she was the famous partner of Fred Astaire, but not so many people know that Ginger and her mother decided to pluck Ginger's first cousin out of Oklahoma City and take her to Hollywood to sort of follow along in Ginger's footsteps and become a movie star. And this is a girl from Oklahoma City who hadn't really done any performing, unlike Ginger, who'd been on Broadway and had already made several movies, both in New York and in Hollywood. And it's in some senses, it's a coming-of-age story, and it's a way of finding yourself through what other people have maybe imposed upon you and told you that this is what you should do and this is how you can do it, and you find just enough success doing it to be encouraged, but then just enough setbacks to know that this isn't maybe what you were meant to be doing. And so through Ginger and her mother Leela, who were so influential and literally adopted, not legally, but practically adopted Phyllis, she comes to recognize that her ambitions are centered elsewhere, and it takes her to another place in a completely different life where she becomes extremely influential in the world of literature, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about it and not give too much away, but when I finished it, I thought the title, The Limits of Limelight, is almost a double entendre. I mean, it really...
Oh, I'm glad you got that.
Oh, yeah. I got
Titles,
it. Yeah.
Titles are so important.
No, really.
Tying it in. Yeah.
It speaks to it so strongly, and I did not know that Ginger Rogers' mother was the ultimate stage mother.
Oh, yes.
Very active in, just to whet people's appetites a little bit, very active in that, what was that committee that really put strict rules on Hollywood in the McCarthy era and said, thou shalt not talk about this?
Right, the code.
Ginger Rogers' mother was,
she was
all about that.
Yes, she was, yes. And she later went on to be part of, she was tied into McCarthy and the House on Un-American Activities. She was very rigid politically and socially.
Wow.
But she was quite a powerhouse. Paul met both Ginger and Leela. So it was fun to pick his brain about what they were like together and separately.
Okay, I'm sorry, you're going to have to tell me that story.
Oh, I've derailed things.
No, I years ago, I knew Ginger somewhat, and I only met her mother once. But her mother, this was at the North Shore Music Theater in Beverly. Ginger was performing there, and after the performance, I went back to talk with her, and Leela was this very forceful presence, watching and listening to everything, making sure Ginger didn't say anything she shouldn't say. And Ginger at the time was in her mid to late 60s, but
Oh my goodness.
yeah, this was in the 70s. But it was, Ginger was very much the dutiful daughter looking to Leela for guidance as to what she should say. And this is a woman at the time who had had a career for over 45 years, but it was fascinating to watch the dynamic. And to see who was really pulling the strings.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I was intimidated by Leela just from reading the book. So you met her in
I thought
person.
she was going to take over the book. Tamping down Leela was like
Yes.
the whole, you're talking about how characters surprise you, and that was a major part of my work, was
Sure.
keeping her from taking over.
Keeping Leela under wraps. Well, we do have plenty of time for your questions, so do we have anybody in the audience yet who wants to break the ice and come to the microphone? We have two great volunteers. We'll do it talk show style. We'll just come around and bring the mic to you. Oh, great, yeah.
Thank you. This question's for Margaret. So our book club is reading A Beautiful Invention. And what I'm curious about, I mean, the level of historical detail in that book is amazing. So, I mean, how long does it take to research something like that in preparation for writing that story?
That's a great question for Margaret, and maybe a little for Mark also, because he researches the places. But go ahead, Margaret. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you to your book group for reading it, and I love visiting book groups who have read it and being able to talk about the story. Beautiful Invention is about Hedy Lamarr, who was a film star and then invented Wi-Fi, which isn't quite true, but she invented a technology that was later used for Wi-Fi during World War II. During World War II, she invented it. Now we use it. The research, that book was my first 20th century set novel. Most of them have been set in the 17th and 18th, early 19th century, where there are many fewer resources, and you have to go to libraries all around the world and look at dusty documents and wear gloves and all this kind of thing. So my first 20th century novel, newspapers, newsreels, television, all these different sources. Hedy wrote a memoir. People wrote about her. I read German magazine articles about her using Google Translate. And the research that I do for any novel, it's what do I need to know to write the story that I want to tell, to develop the plot that I need to tell, and to just make the character real in the way that I see the character. But it is the wealth of information was almost overpowering, and so that to me that's why I'm taking a break from Hollywood books and going back to the 17th century, just because it's quite overpowering. And I don't remember. I'm not like Paul. I don't track my hours. I don't track my weeks or months or even years. But I did spend quite a long time on the research, and thank you. I'm glad that it's working. It's not, the thing about research is you don't want to just overload something with research. You have to make it make sense. And you're not just trying to show off how much you know. You're trying to tie it into the character, to the plot, to the time, to the setting, all of that. And that's what I love about writing any kind of fiction, but historical fiction and biographical fiction particularly.
It's a great question. I remember interviewing Anita Diamond, the Red Tent. Some of you may know her, many years ago. And she said one of the most important things her editor said to her, this relates to what you just said, is, Anita, your research is showing.
Yeah.
Like someone say your slip is showing, because she was just so excited about the research, and she was like, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And her editor said, your research is showing. What about you, Mark? How long does it take you to research these settings? You probably have an advantage because you know them so well already, given your background in tourism. But yeah, talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, there's good news and bad news. When I'm working in one of the finer hotels in the state, generally my wife and I are guests at the property. And it's a tough job that somebody has to do, as they say.
I know, I'm thinking that's a good gig.
But my books have taken anywhere from a year to write, and toward the end of this, I'll tell you about another story, but my longest has taken over 60 years to research. What I generally do is I develop an encyclopedia, which is a spiral-bound notebook with tabs. And if I know that at some point during my writing, it's going to come into play that a bridge was built, and during a typical bridge building, X number of lives were were lost at such and such a cost. I don't have time to go looking that up while I'm writing it. I'll lose my trend of thought. And so all I need to do is hit the tab and enter that into the story. But I would say typically for me, it's a 2-year process. The first book in the Kerry Turnell series, which was called The Last Resort, took me about 10 years, simply because I went to the president of the Balsams, who was a very good friend named Steve Barba. Some of you may have met him. Steve, I walked into his office and said, listen, I'd like to write a murder mystery set at your property. And frankly, I half expected him to drop kick me out of the office. But quite the contrary, he was really excited and said, I tell you what, you come to the resort a lot. Every time you come, why don't I introduce you to 1 or 2 of my department heads? And at the time, I thought, this is fantastic. What an opportunity. Well, it took years and years to interview all of his department heads. Some of you may not realize it if you're just a casual guest at a grand hotel, but it's a city, in effect. And so by the time I finished interviewing all of his department heads and organizing that material, probably 8 years had gone by. But it was a wonderful experience. The one sour note attached to it was that while I was there, Steve arranged for a local, my mind, I'm going to space the name, a local reporter from the paper up that way to interview me. And the two of us really hit it off, and he was writing a book, and I encouraged him to continue writing, and he was one of the ones who was murdered by that fellow that ran amok about 15 years ago.
In Colebrook?
Yes.
In real...
Oh my goodness. Yeah, 1997. Oh, Dennis Jose.
That's the man.
Dennis Jose. Yeah, he
That's
was a
right.
newspaper man. So as a journalist, I
Yes.
remember. Yeah, I remember covering that story. Oh, that's tragic. Yeah.
Very fine gentleman.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you for the question about research, and it's really interesting. And I think we had another audience member over here. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you for coming out. Love the questions.
Okay, so this is for whoever puts their hand up first. I wouldn't dream of saying, where do your ideas come from? But what is the wackiest idea you've ever had? And did it come to fruition?
Oh my gosh, these are great. You guys have to help me write my scripts next time. This is wonderful.
My quick answer is I had a dream, and I dreamed a certain scene, and it turned into a book. This was way early in my career, but it was the scene of it was kind of a love scene, nothing steamy or anything, but like a conversation where 2 people were trying to work out this relationship thing, and I built a whole book around it, and that's where the idea came from. And usually it comes from whatever I'm researching now, and then I come across something and go, oh, that's a book. Either the next book or a book 10 years from now, doesn't matter, but it's usually in the process of writing that you find the next thing.
Do you want to jump in on that too, Virginia? And Mark, I can see you jump in too, but the wackiest idea? And did it come to fruition? Right, that was the second part of the question.
So I write contemporary fiction, very much rooted in the here and now. So I, up to now, haven't published historical fiction or fantasy or anything like that. I think probably more of the wacky ideas came when I was little, when I was younger, and actually often they come to now when I speak to my children at bedtime, and it's lights out and they're trying to kind of expand their bedtime routine, and they'll say, Mummy, tell me a story from your heart, which is really sweet, which is kind of a mistaken kind of way of saying, children say, tell me a story off by heart, and say, tell me a story from your heart, which is very sweet. And probably the wackiest thing, which my little 8-year-old wants me to write as a children's story, is called The Moon Fox, and it's about foxes that live on the moon. She fell in love with foxes, and I haven't written a children's book yet, but it's called The Moon Fox, and it's a group of foxes who live on the moon, and a little girl goes to visit them on the moon, and she wants them to persuade them to come to the earth and live on the earth, but they can't because they need the moonbeams to stay alive. And so that sounds very, very crazy.
Good.
Like anything that I have ever written, because I write quite gritty contemporary fiction. So I suppose that's probably the wackiest thing, and it's inspired by my little girl, and who knows whether it will ever
to come to fruition. But yes, watch out for the moon foxes.
Sounds good to me. How about you, Mark? I could see you wanted to jump in there.
Yes, when I was about 12 years old, I went to a Western in the old Victory Theater in New London, Connecticut. Or at least I thought I did. I thought I saw a Western with a fantastic ending. And I kept trying to find that Western year after year after year. I ultimately went all the way out to the Gene Autry Museum in California and asked if someone could tell me what the name of this movie was. And they didn't know what I was talking about. So I went to see a fellow who was studying Westerns at the Yale Film School in Connecticut. He didn't know what I was talking about. They sent me to a fellow in North Carolina who supposedly had videotape or had VCR tapes of every Western ever made. I told him about the story and he said, "I'll send it to you, send me $10. I sent him $10. He sent me the movie. It wasn't the movie. So, the fellow I went to the movie with is still my best friend. He lives out in California, and he was visiting me, and I said to him, "I've got to ask you if you remember the name of this movie." And I told him about the ending of the movie, which was the particularly strong part. And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." So I just wrote the book.
That's one way to solve it. Yeah. Another audience question? Oh my goodness, that's great. See whoever can get to the microphone first there.
Hi, thank you. I think my question, I want to, if I can express it correctly, for Margaret or Virginia, kind of the line between reality and fiction. And I think it would be different, Margaret, you're writing sometimes sort of recreations of stories, and how do you draw that line between what you learn and what might have really happened or what you want to have happen? And Virginia, if you are taking any inspiration from real life people, how do you turn that into a story that isn't really about somebody, because they might not like that so much if you told that story? So just sort of a two-part question. I've heard of the line between reality and fiction.
Right. No, that's a great question. Virginia, do you want to go first on that?
That's such a lovely question, and I think that's such an intrinsic part of the creative process as well, is sort of straddling that line between observing real life. So I think when you write contemporary fiction, your research is quite journalistic. So you're talking to real life people who are living now and experiencing the issues that you're writing about every day. And I think what I tend to do is, so for example, I have a Border Patrol officer as a character in my books that's set in sort of northern New Hampshire. And I spent time in Maine with the Border Patrol family, and actually they were quite an inspiration for the book because they are great believers in gun ownership, and he gave me this wonderful anecdote, which I used in the book, which he has 2 children, a little boy and a little girl, and he said to me, "Oh, when I found out my wife was pregnant with my daughter, the first thing I did was I went out to buy a pink rifle." And I just sat there, as a British person, slightly stunned that this is what you would do. But he said it with such pride because firearms are part of his life and his experience. And him particularly as a character, it was really interesting because he wanted to inform me about the research. So he took me to a gun range. He taught me to shoot everything from a pistol to fully automatic. He showed me about the importance of safety, and he gave me very openly his kind of pro-gun ownership views. He didn't want me to identify him in the book, and so the character is completely different in personality and style and in appearance, but quite a bit of what I learned from him. And also crucially, and this is where I think stories are really important, I think Border Patrol officers have often been presented quite negatively in this country, just from my perception of the news. And actually my American editor said to me, "I think your Border Patrol officer is a bit nice. Are you aware of, the larger issues in America?" And I was like, well, that's the whole point of fiction. It's to surprise readers and to show that there isn't one type of human being in one particular profession. And so with this character, as I said, the Border Patrol officer in my book is completely unrecognizable, but the character that I spent time with and that I learnt from sort of infused the inspiration behind the character. And then I think one of the interesting things is location-wise. I wanted to have the freedom to create a fictional town, and I have a friend who's a graphic designer, and she drew a map of the book, of the town that it's called Middlebrook, that appears. So it's set in a very real place in northern New Hampshire. There's the Canadian border not too far, which is important for the Border Patrol officer. There's Colebrook, which is nearby, which is important for the hospital. But the town itself is completely fictional, and it was so much fun. I could put all the things I love about, you know, the New England kind of architecture, the white steeple church, the pond with the dock, the main street, that, you know, create a really beautiful, quintessential American town. And again, so I played with kind of my experiences and my observations, and with real life, and then fictionalized it. And that's one of the most joyful things of writing, I think, is creating something that is tangibly real for a reader, but is nevertheless fiction.
And Margaret, too, and that's tricky for your latest 2 novels, because you're writing fiction about real people.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I always come back to the words of Dolan Perkin Valdez, who wrote the novel Wench and has a new book coming out, African-American novelist and historian and professor and all kinds of great things. And she articulated this at a writers' conference a few years ago, and I realized this is exactly what I'm doing. She says, where is the gap in the record? So you have the record, you're building, rebuilding, recreating a life, a fictional life of an actual historical person in the case of my 2 most recent novels. But there are always gaps in terms of motivation, gaps in terms of dialogue and conversations with other people, gaps in terms of reactions and responses, which might, especially for Hedy Lamarr, where she was in the newspaper every single day for 10 or 15 years. I had this wealth, getting back to the research thing, I just had more information than I could stand. So I had to look at it and say, okay, number one, was this what the publicist said about her? And if it was, how did she feel about having her life exposed in this way? Was it even true? And then with the invention part, there are things that she never explained about how she developed the frequency hopping technology. And so I was able to sort of invent what she invented in a way that she and her co-inventor had only left sort of hints about. So there's always, even with real people, especially with real people, I mean, there's so much that you do not know. And we're writing to entertain. I'm not specifically writing to inform, but I am a stickler for accuracy. I don't want to, if something is known about something, then I want it to be completely accurate in the book. If something is not known, then I have a license to make things up. So I hope that answers your question, Sarah.
Well, and I wanted to ask all of you about New Hampshire in particular, since, you know, Virginia talked about the landscape inspiring her and how she tries to, you know, honor and celebrate that landscape in her book, and the culture of New Hampshire too. And Paul, I'll start with you actually. Our state, as you know, has a very strong tradition of generating authors and poets. I don't know if it's something in the water or the granite, but we've got a lot of authors and poets in this state. What does the atmosphere feel like for writers here in Concord? Let's bring it down a little more local, Paul.
I think it's amazing, and I think a focal point of that certainly is Gibson's bookstore, because Gibson's, as I have quoted many times, is an author's best friend. You don't have to be on the New York Times bestseller list to be greeted with warmth and enthusiasm, to have a wonderful event there to launch your book, and people come out for it. And people in Concord are very curious about what people write, and they're really supportive of it. There's a drive or an undercurrent of energy and fascination, because I think a lot of people are curious themselves. Could they write? Do they have it in them? And they like to see someone local become successful and follow that. And I think they may either live vicariously through that success, or it may be a motivation that makes them decide, gee, I'd like to try something and see where it might go.
And I know book clubs are big everywhere, but I feel like they're really big in Concord. I don't know. How many people here are a member of a book club? Okay, some of you could think about that. Just saying. What about you, Virginia, as a relative newcomer? What's the sort of terrain or support for writers feel like in our beautiful capital city?
I'll just expand a bit further than that. So the reason I'm in New England is because in my 20s I would come to writing retreats in Massachusetts and Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire, and I was just blown away by these groups of often women, actually just turned out that way, the courses that I went to, who lived in this part of the world and loved creativity, loved writing poetry, loved writing fiction. And it felt really unique. England is steeped in literature and poetry and art, but I hadn't ever really experienced inhabiting a place where it was just part of the fabric of a society or a community. And I actually stumbled across Concord a little bit by accident. So I knew I wanted to live in New England. I loved New Hampshire particularly. My husband had a job in Concord, so we came here. And as soon as we moved here, we were just really impressed and excited to be part of a community that values and cherishes books so much. You were saying about Saturdays in the library. The first thing I did, 2 places that I inhabited when I first moved here, every Saturday morning I would go with my then toddler and then the other 2 who were born in Concord Hospital to the library. And I met so many people there who love books, who love writing, who are part of book clubs. I was embraced by the librarians. They became friends. They came to my baby showers. And then Hugh, actually, when he applied for a job here, the first place he went to was Gibson's bookstore, and he went to the cafe and he wrote me a little email and he said, "I'm in a bookstore. It's really wonderful. I think you'll love it. I think this could be our home." And that's been the case. Gibson's is just such, as you said, a welcoming place, whether you're a super famous author, and they host those too, or whether you're a rising author or a local author. And Michael is this wonderful gentleman who is very unshowy and humble, but is extraordinary in the work that he does in that bookstore. And I actually spend most of my time writing in the little cafe there. And I sit there on a Monday, for example, with 2 fellow authors. One of them, Marjorie Burke, who's here today. One of them is a young adult author called Erin. Every single Monday, and sometimes several times a week, we sit there and have coffee and we write. And we don't necessarily chat much. We just sit there with our computers. Irene is here today too. She's a writer. She's written this extraordinary picture book that addresses mental health issues. So many times I'm overhearing people talking about writing, wanting to write, or working on a project. And yes, it must be in the water or
something.
in the ether or something, but it just feels like such a warm and wonderful place culturally as a writer to inhabit.
Go ahead, Margaret. Yeah.
I want to point out that there are so many resources that are available and accessible. The New Hampshire Writers Project, which is a wonderful organization, they have in different areas of the state, they have like the Writers' Night Out, or the first night, there's a first night of the month that writers can get together. There's Seacoast Poets, there's the Monadnock Writers Group, there's the Merrimack Valley Writers Group, there's the New Hampshire Center for the Book. We are just surrounded. You can hardly take advantage of all of it, but it's all there. Of course, I feel the same about Gibson's and the library.
I keep telling Michael we should have a literary festival in Concord. Literary festivals
That's
are
a
really
good
big in
idea.
England,
Yes.
and I just feel like we have so many, also very big name authors locally who would, be the headliners. But that's kind of one of my dreams, is that we.
But there's just no one has an excuse not to be part of the writing community. It's very welcoming, and there's so many flavors, so many types of writers: fiction, nonfiction, memoir, poetry. It's just very affirming and very supportive, and it's just easy to talk to people, to mentor people, to share experiences.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions from the audience, then I have a couple wrap-up questions, and then the second part of our evening will begin, where our authors will go out into the lobby and they've got books to sell and to sign for you. But I'd love to squeeze in a couple more audience questions if we could. So, oh boy, yes, great. I'm going to let the volunteers decide where to hand that mic.
Hi, Laura. It's Rachel. Nice to see you.
Hi, Rachel.
And nice to meet all of you. I am a newly published author of a memoir called I Sang Anyway. So my question, for all of you authors is, I would love to hear, what is the best marketing advice you ever received?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, because as somebody alluded to earlier, I think it was Virginia, the business side of this is, you know, Margaret mentioned all that wonderful support in the community, and then there's the business side, which can be less wonderful and supportive sometimes. So, Paul, what do you think? The best marketing advice you ever got? I love that question, Rachel. Thank you.
Be relentless.
Be relentless.
You
Wow.
really need to be constantly on Facebook and social media, or sending out press releases, requesting newspapers, magazines to do stories, and believe in your work so much that you make them feel that enthusiasm and want to have you, share your story with them or their readers or listeners or whatever. But you have to be relentless in it.
Wow, that's great. I'll go down the line. Virginia, best marketing advice.
I don't know if I've been given actual advice, but just how I've come to it personally, I think it can feel quite wearing, though, that sense of having to constantly market yourself and push yourself and publish yourself, especially if you're a personality who's not kind of, that way inclined. So what I would say actually is try to find a part of the marketing process that you enjoy instinctively and become an expert in that and find a community in that. So, for example, I'm someone who doesn't get much joy from Twitter. My editor and my agent always, you should be on Twitter. In England, all the authors are on Twitter. But it's not a way of communicating that I enjoy much. It doesn't suit my personality. It's not something that I enjoy spending time on. On the other hand, Instagram is something that I actually enjoy. I find it very aesthetic. I find it very beautiful. I love to read this better crafted, pieces that authors write. I love the sense of community there is on there. And I think perhaps sometimes just investing in perhaps one area of social media, say, and building a platform and a network and a group and community and doing it really well and professionally can actually pay more than having a scattergun approach. And then actually I'll be quite controversial and say, one of my editors at Little Brown said, the jury's out as to whether social media presence actually has any effect on your success as a writer. The best thing you can do is to love the process and make your product as good as it can be. So yes, be relentless and try and be out there as much as you can, but don't forget that really it's about the craft. And what I would say is find a place in that world that you actually enjoy spending time in and become good at that rather than feeling you have to be everywhere all the time.
Wow. Yeah. Great advice. Mark, how about you? Best marketing advice?
I'm probably the worst person to ask this question to. But that said, I haven't explored the social media as much as I might have. What little effort I've made has not been terribly successful. I honestly feel as though if you're writing in an area wherein there are people who are interested in what you're doing, you should try to find inroads into that network and go directly to them. And those people in turn will have others who will have an interest in what you're doing. And that may be a way to get things going. I write in the tourism field, and I am beginning to find that the tourism industry is taking an interest in my books. But it's taken a long time. It's a slow process. I'm sure you didn't write your book with the idea that you were going to become an overnight millionaire. If that was the case, well, I do have a couple numbers you could possibly call.
Congratulations, though. It's a huge achievement to publish them.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But that, in my mind, is beginning to be the most successful thing.
In it for the long haul. So
Absolutely.
Margaret, how about you? Best marketing advice?
I agree with what all my colleagues have said, but I would say the best advice that I've ever received is to be yourself. Be relentlessly yourself. Be authentically you, and figure out what it is about you that ties into your book, telling your story, especially as a memoir, it's all about you. So that makes it a little bit easier. And then different aspects and different strands of what it is about you that will interest readers, and what it is about your story. Working with publicists, whether it's with publishing companies, sometimes they want you to follow paths like Twitter that don't feel comfortable, or present yourself in a way that's not as authentic as it might be. And readers are interested in the people behind the books, and so you want to present yourself as the person that you are in your social media or in your personal appearances and all of that, so that you build that connection. So that's mine.
So, unfortunately, we are almost out of time. I cannot believe how quickly this has gone, but I do need to leave time for you to go out and meet the authors face to face, for you to buy some books, for them to sign books. So I do want to leave some time for that. So just one more question, if I could, and I think I'll start with you, Mark, just briefly, and I know it's hard when authors talk about their books. Give us a little taste of what your next project is.
Okay. Well, other than the Western that I mentioned, stay tuned. I have been working with the tourism industry for so long, and a good portion of my motivation in writing these books was to promote New Hampshire as a tourism destination. And so you'll find these out in the lobby. I've developed something called the Carrie Turnell's my investigator, mystery tour. The idea is that you buy the books, go to the sites throughout that are mentioned. There are 33 different places throughout New Hampshire. Visit them, and actually we're going to have a contest coming up. There's an alternative. You can go to the sites, see if they look like they're interesting places to you, come back and read the books that relate to them.
So it's a win-win, really.
It is a win-win. It is a win-win. And I really feel as though, I think you'll find not only the settings, but my character is an interesting guy. He's a guy who has powers of observation that I only wish I had. My wife would tell you that she could bring an elephant into the house, and it would take me an hour to find it. This guy can find a gnat in a corner of the room in seconds. So that's what I'm working on.
Oh, that's exciting. Margaret, how about you? What's your next project?
As I said before, my next project is I've gone back in time from the 20th century Hollywood to 17th century, and I've done a retelling and a reimagining of a story that exists in another art form. And I have provided the front story and the back story and what happens next, because the story itself raises some questions, has for me for a long time. But I've taken this story and I've placed it in the French court of the 17th century. So Louis XIV, his court, the sort of scandals and the court culture of the 17th century France, and set some of the places that I visited that are somewhat familiar to me, as well as a little bit in Paris as well. So it was a book that just came to me. I dropped everything I was doing. I decided I have to write this book, and I wrote it in a flash, and now it will be out sometime later this year.
Oh, that's exciting. Right. That's great. How about you, Paul? What are you up to next?
I have one coming out in June called A Sprinkling of Stardust Over the Outhouse. And
okay.
Set in Concord and in Hollywood.
Really?
But I'm starting work on one called The Park. It's a mystery set in White's Park, and the reason it's White's Park is because it's set in 1962, when everyone in the neighborhood called it White's Park. And it's during the Peanut Carnival, which was an annual event, and a body is found floating in the pond, and it's fictional, but the characters in it, Chief Walter Carlson starts to investigate. He's aided and abetted by Betty Abbott, who was the Director of Recreation and Parks. And so it's set about figuring out what brought the body there, and other bodies are discovered in the park over the course of the story. But I go there almost every day for a walk. It's perfectly safe.
I live very close to White Park, so.
Yes.
Wow. So talk about hyper-local. That's great. That's great. How about you, Virginia? What's your next project? Recognizing that really the Children's Secret is just out.
Yes, it is. So I've been spending a bit too much time with Margaret because her historical fiction has been rubbing off on me, and she's also very much encouraged me in this field. So I've been avoiding writing a book for about 10 years that my agent has been very keen for me to write, which is set in the Second World War, and it is inspired by my German grandparents who were part of the resistance. And they were both married to different people, but they had a lifelong love affair, and my mother and her identical twin sister are the children of that love affair. And they, as I said, my grandfather particularly was part of the Stauffenberg plot, and was executed because, as we know, it failed, and he was discovered as being one of the conspirators. And I used every argument in the book as to why I didn't want to write it. So, you know, everyone's read enough about the Second World War. My agent said, no, people are still interested in the Second World War. I always go back to it. You know, oh, it's too close to my family. It feels a bit terrifying on that level. And then, you know, my mother said, no, it would be a real honoring of your grandmother's story. And so I try, and I'm not a historical fiction writer. That was another excuse I gave myself, which Margaret helped me with a lot, and said, but you're a writer, and it's not that different, and here you can. And so I have written the first draft, and my agent has just given me positive feedback as well as lots of edits. And I think we're hoping for that to be out on submission, which means if you have a literary agent, they then send it to lots of different publishing houses in September. So I've got a few months to finish the edits, and that will be my first historical fiction book. I don't know if I'll ever write another historical fiction book. I hope I did a good job. It has taught me a tremendous amount, including a great deal of admiration for historical novelists, because it's a very different beast. So there we go. We'll see what happens. Watch this space.
What a big year for our authors. That's great. And I am very sorry to say that is all the time we have for the conversation part of our evening. Again, I really want to thank our sponsors. Without them, this evening does not happen. The Dupree Companies, Gibson's Bookstore, Concord Public Library, and Concord TV. Please join us now in the lobby. Don't rush home. I know it's a Wednesday night in Concord, but prove the predictors wrong that people rush home during the week here in Concord, because our authors are going to be out there. They've got stacks of books to sign for you and to sell, plus the bar is still open, just saying. So you can go out and get a drink and mingle some more. So I'll see you out there. Thanks everybody for being with us. This has been just boatloads of fun. Thank you.